The first thing I think is not to be contrarian, but I think there's a lot of misconceptions that arise from this discussion actually centrally rooted within the purveyors of the Islamic tradition itself. As someone who has worked in a madrasa before, a traditional seminary, the difficulties often are in actually just passing the tradition. So I wanted to start with the tradition and the perceptions of the tradition. So religion essentially, in how people understand it, is a transmitted form of conveying people's rituals, rites, relationships with God and the rest of creation in a very distilled format. That tradition is at least what people refer to as kind of rites and religious teachings and ethics and so on. And so when starting, I thought we'd start with how people perceive some of the discussion around rationalism, rationalists, and Islamic intellectual thinkers in history. Because usually it's posited as rational on one side and rationalists on one side and traditionalists on the other. The old question of what has Athens got to do with Jerusalem, or in this case Mecca, is often situated in that way. Whereas actually the irony here is I think it's the other way around. The tradition, historically, how it was shaped for various reasons, initially because of apologetic reasons, and then as a framework of thinking about all matters of religion, actually it was the other way around. What I mean by that is the modern aversion to intellectual inquiry that is associated with the religious dogmatists is actually antithetical to what is mainstream, and I use that deliberately, mainstream orthodoxy in terms of how matters of creed, first principles are discussed, the foundations of law were debated, and even in how the relationship between rationale and scripture was mediated in practice of legal edicts. So to start with, to give an example, one of the really well-known, or the most, what's considered, although contentiously considered, orthodoxy, at least in terms of majority, is the Ash'ari school of Islamic theology. The Ash'arites are seen as the flag bearers alongside the Maturidiyya, or the Maturidites, as Islamic orthodoxy. And there's some people accept the Athari, or the scripturalists, to be as part of that as well. Now they had all these early debates regarding actually how do we actually arrive at truth? So this is one of the first discussions. And for some of you who have laboured through a madrasa education or a study of Islamic Aqidah, then you know that you pick up a text like Nasafi's Aqidah and it starts off with, how do we know anything? And they start off with, well, the first way is sensation, it's ihsas. And the second way is aql, or the intellect. And the third is akhbar, or transmission. And then the fourth is adat, or actually customary knowledge. And they discuss all these things, and the final thing they talk about is ilham, or inspiration. And so they go through all these as, if you like, scales of how do you have knowledge. And then there's this huge debate in history. So as an example, the mainstream Ash'ari position actually was the intellect trumps sensation, because logic trumps sensory data. That was kind of the mainstream position, although there were very, very well-known, notable kind of exceptions to this stuff. Ibn Taymiyyah being one of those notable exceptions, who was much more an empiricist and he wrote a whole 6-volume work explaining why Aristotelian logic doesn't arrive at certain conclusions, and we should restrict our conclusions to that which has empirical data, observed phenomena. There were other scholars that, like Imam al-Ghazali, who famously took the intellect and then perception, or sensory data, and then you had those that actually considered scripture to trump sensory perception, but not the intellect, like Imam Baqillani, the famous mutakallim and student of Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari. Eventually, the kind of orthodox settled position was the scale of knowledge is logic, sensory data, and then scripture. And actually, Zahawi, a famous kind of Iraqi scholar from the turn of the beginning of the 1900s, who wrote his refutation of Al-Fajr al-Sadiq against Ibn Abdul Wahhab's Salafi movement, he explains actually the biggest problem with Salafism was that it turned everything upside down. So scripture became more fundamental than rational proof. So there are interesting debates and discussions about this in Islamic orthodoxy. So the most well-known one and contentious one is about what's God like, what's God's nature. And so intellectually speaking, it was argued that God, there must be the universe exists, it doesn't have to exist, but it does exist. This existence is only contingent. Therefore, there must be something that brings it about, and that something must be external to the universe. It can't be like it, and therefore, rationally speaking, or logically speaking, rather than rationally speaking, it must be an external creator, and it can't be like anything in creation. And so any pieces of scripture which liken the creation with the creator should be interpreted or just left alone. So God being on a throne, God being male, God having a hand or a face, these are either interpreted as in their linguistic expressions, Yadullahi fawqa aydihim, God's hand is above their hands as a reference to the pledge, was either interpreted to mean his affinity, or his strength, or his support, or was just, we leave it as it is. Those are the two. But we definitely know it doesn't mean hand in the primary lexical sense, because God's not human. And so that was the kind of orthodox position of the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. They had this prioritization of the intellectual principles above scriptural information. And so this became more contentious on other issues. So this became very easy on matters of fundamentals of creed. But some of the things I mentioned, it becomes more contentious. So like the very famous one, and again, amongst the Ash'aris where they have different opinions, was things like magic. I watched Doctor Strange. Have you guys seen Doctor Strange? Great movie. And as much as I'm not a big fan of Deepak Chopra and the kind of like, I insulted half the audience. Anyway, there's when looking, this was a big debate in Muslim history about, does magic actually have a reality or is it just an illusion? Ironically, if you go back, and it's ironic because maybe people from the Indian subcontinent tradition who tend to follow Abu Hanifa, they take the exact opposite position of Abu Hanifa, the first founder of the Islamic schools of jurisprudence. And this is really well documented. Mazari brings it in his commentary of Sahih Muslim. That actually Abu Hanifa was of the view that, look, people believing that magic has a reality, they've just lost the plot. A, it's false. B, it kind of contradicts the rules of the universe, that we see things happen by natural laws that are repeated each time we observe them. And C, it kind of is a bit superstitious and a bit shirky. It's a bit kind of polytheistic to associate other people to have powers in the universe which are supernatural. And so Abu Hanifa rejected this outright. And the famous literalist, and I say it's literalist because the assumptions and the connotations with this, was Ibn Hazm, the 4th or 5th century after Hijrah. His introduction to his law book, he has this whole discussion about beliefs, and he says, look, if you believe people have magical powers, then you're really a pagan. So it's really shirk. It's not really part of Islamic teaching. There's all these, and the Orthodoxy had this kind of split about this. So the very famous Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, who came kind of somewhere before Ibn Taymiyyah and after Al-Ghazali, he has a massive commentary of the Quran called Mafatih al-Ghaib, Keys to the Unseen, which sounds very mystic, but actually he's a polymath and a rationalist. And he discusses these things regarding things like magic and so on. And he says, well, look, on the day of jinn possession, the demons possessing you. And he says, look, on the day of reckoning, we're told this story that Satan stands up and he says, I didn't do anything. I just whispered to you guys and you guys did everything you wanted to do. And he says, if Satan's the greatest demon and all he can do is whisper, then surely this is ridiculous to believe any other jinn can possess you. And so this became a position amongst the Ash'arites. They had a firm belief that you had to be fair and just, you had to earn paradise, you had to be a good person, otherwise you went to hell. As opposed to, look, really, at the end of the day, no one really deserves hell or deserves heaven. It's divine grace, which was the Sunni position, based on the famous tradition of the Prophet, where none of you enters paradise by your deeds. No one has salvation by your deeds. It's just God's mercy. So, actually, ironically looking back, the rationalist disposition was something fairly orthodox. And when you look at this in terms of one of the other things I said I'd talk about, things like gender equality and principles around this, you find this actually goes all the way back to the very conception and inception of Islam. One time, there's a Facebook post, because that's where all great things happen nowadays. There was a Facebook post where there was an event that was being held regarding Fatima al-Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there's all these great men speaking, and someone pointed out that it's ironic that they're talking about this great woman, and it's a bunch of 10 men speaking about her. And it ensued a big discussion, and one of the things that stands out was actually two things. That one of the famous incidents in the Quran, because the Quran actually it narrates incidents that happens at the time of the Prophet. And one of them is a woman who comes and complains about her mistreatment by her husband, and she's declared as zihar, or like my mother's back, and this is a very pagan thing, it was very horrific, and the Prophet didn't know how to react to this. And then, the story says, God revealed the verse, قَدْ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُكَ. Indeed, God heard the argument of the woman who's arguing with you. And so she became famous as, this is the woman who God listens to. She stands up in public, she debates with the Prophet, she brings her argument to the Prophet. And so famously the caliphs would stop whenever she would come to them, and they would stop whatever they're doing and they would listen to her. And then people would come, why are you listening to this old woman? God listens to her. We give her time of day. And so it roots back to that. And so you find these really famous incidents in the way they looked at traditions. And famously, there's Imam Zarkashi wrote a whole book on Aisha and her corrections of the companions' hadith, jurisprudence, judicial verdicts, and political positions. And this is what it's all about. It's the istidrakat al-Aisha al-Sahaba. It's the corrections of the companions, corrections of Aisha on the companions. It starts off with things like narrations. So you have this hadith, it's well transmitted. Abu Hurairah says, the prayer is broken if a dog goes past you or a woman. And she's like, you're comparing us to women? Really? You're comparing us to dogs? And so she's like, look, what the Prophet said was, one of the Jewish mythologies is that women are a bad omen, etc., etc. And actually, I checked this with David Tobe's dad, and he reassured me, yes, this is part of the tradition, and it's something that's said. And it's like, and actually that was just a misunderstanding. It was the Prophet correcting this idea at the time, and it became mainstreamed. And Aisha's like, well, no, this is just wrong. And so Imam Shatibi in his Muwafaqat, he says this was the tradition of the Salaf, i.e. the early patristic writers, Abu Hanifa and Malik. They would look at hadith tradition in the light of rational principles, in the light of transmission of more fundamental principles or universals that you spoke about, and they would weigh it accordingly. And so there's a lot of these examples that happen, both in the substance of the law and in the principles that happen. So substance of the law, less interesting, very particular, but as an example of that, again, a narration comes through that says, if you make wudu, if you're purifying yourself, and you use water, the Prophet commanded people to make wudu every time they ate something hot, anything that was touched by the fire. And again, Abu Hurairah narrates this. And Ibn Abbas, he starts laughing. And he's like, what do you mean? Why are you laughing? He's like, well, it's cold. we're going to make wudu, we're going to heat the water up with the fire, and then we make wudu. Do we have to make wudu from the wudu that we made because the water was touched by the fire? And Abu Huraira gets really upset. It's like, you're mocking the prophetic tradition. I'm telling you the Prophet said this, and you're having a laugh about it. And Ibn Abbas is like, kind of. Which may be seen as blasphemous by some today. But essentially that is, Shatibi brings all these examples, and he brings a lot from Aisha, where just takes hadith, people come and say, people are punished in their grave because, your family are crying for you. And Aisha's like, this is just wrong. No one is responsible for somebody else's actions. It's just wrong. And then she says, to back it up, just because people, you know how people are, you need to cite scripture sometimes just to reinforce something that's common sense. And it says, look, لا تزر وزرة وازرة لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. No bearer of deeds is responsible for somebody else's deeds. ليس عليك إلا ما صنع. You don't have to do it. You have nothing upon you except what you've striven for. You're not responsible for that. And there's a lot of these traditions. The Shatibi brings a lot. And I know the Muwaffaqat is being translated by Imran Hassan Khan Niyazi. It's really interesting work. And that section of all of Aisha's hadith, he brings them. He brings a whole load to show this is how the early Muslims used to look at odd narrations. They would kind of think, well, this either is irrational, it conflicts with higher principles, or it just conflicts with how we view things like gender and the roles of gender. Usually women would point out these issues. And so this became a maxim, if you like, that was lost, and people debate what the reason was. Was it Shafi'i and his Risala and the power of his work? He's considered like the St. Paul of Islam for modern day Muslims, that essentially he shapes the development of the Islamic tradition. Muslims are the religion of Shafi'i now, as Christians are the religion of St. Paul, meaning they mediate Islamic scripture by the usul that Shafi'i essentially developed, the principles that he developed. Is that why? Or is it just that we've lost basic connection to any of our intellectual heritage at all? And so when it comes down to it, then actually this was well debated up until the 9th century even, of Islamic heritage, which is roughly the 13th century, 12th or 13th century, 1200s, 1300s. You had Imam al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, very, very famous, well-known Shafi'i scholar, and he wrote two books on this subject. One was actually just a summary of the other, and it was called Qawaid al-Anam fi Masalih al-Ahkam. It is great principles in understanding the public welfare of rulings. And he has this same discussion. He says, first of all, when you're looking at Sharia, it's rational. He says anything that's irrational is going to be something ritualistic. I mean, that's super rational. So your prayers, your fasting, the day of your fasting, these things are connected to something that you may not be able to rationalize, but rules to do with social transactions, they're there for rational purpose. And they're understood by using the mind, by looking at their rationale, by looking at human custom and norms, and anything outside of that is going to be something kind of very specifically fideistic, ritualistic. And so he then divides the rules into means and ends, and he says, look, the means and the ends have to be connected in your rules, otherwise you've just not understood them. And so Shatibi, who comes on, is famously attributed to be the kind of person that expands on the concept of maqasid to develop into a system. He elaborates this a lot, and he makes the point that one really interesting point. He just says, look, if you find a piece of scripture and you can't reconcile it with rational principles or first principles, then just say you don't know, or leave it be, because it just means you haven't been able to reconcile it. And he says, otherwise you'll end up, in his words, where you'll end up with a stupid conclusion. And I'm sure there's lots of examples of that we see today. There's a great fatwa you can read about the Islamic ruling on eating mermaids. And there's a huge debate regarding its licit or illicit nature. And, because everything in the sea is halal. It's if it's a mermaid, it's in the sea, it's like fish.
It's female.
Well, there's all sorts of debates. there's a whole. I'm not going to go there. But this became a whole discussion regarding, and you see people having, that question was asked to Sheikh Saleh Fawzan, who's living today. And admittedly, in the past, a few hundred years ago, when they were debating it, they would say, well, people report these things exist. And they would put it in that context. Today, maybe Sheikh Saleh, to be fair, in the desert, there's not a lot of seas, so you wouldn't know if there's mermaids. But he answers the question seriously and says, obviously, it's halal to eat mermaids because they're in the sea. And mermen, but I don't want to misquote the Sheikh.
Didn't he think it was cannibalistic?
No, because al-bahr wa ma fihi hillu wa tahur, the sea and everything. So the famous story is, I keep saying famous because it's popular amongst religious nerds. The companions are going on a trip. They're going to be on a boat. They haven't got much clean water. Can we use the seawater to wash and keep our clean water for drinking? And the Prophet says, look, the sea and everything in it is pure and it's halal. So, that's the kind of maxim. Don't worry about it. And so that's what they will say. Well, mermaids are in the sea. There's also big debates about crabs because they're really sea animals and they're beach animals. There's all these things in jurisprudence where people can have lots of discussions. But coming back from the mermaids is that actually this notion of looking at rules and regulations by a rational discourse I think is actually quite important in the social context, which is actually to say rulings are not placed and situated outside of social change or social impact. So the principle just became rounded down to al-umur bil-maqasid. The matters are judged by their intent. And so the things which are forbidden for themselves, they're just bad, you don't do them. Like murder, stuff like that's bad, you don't do them. Other things which they're not forbidden for themselves, they're forbidden as a means to an end. You judge them by whether they lead to that end or not. And this is why the really well-known discussion about Umar bin al-Khattab and how he used to look at rulings all the time was always by not really getting too bogged up with what the Prophet said, but really what was the context.
Context and intent.
Context and intent. So Imam al-Juwayni, and this is quite relevant now, I think, because of some of the conversations people are having about slavery and Islamic injunctions on slavery. Imam al-Juwayni was the teacher of Imam al-Ghazali, arguably one of the greatest thinkers in Islamic belief systems. He writes about Aqidah, he writes about belief, he writes about usul. He wrote his 22-volume work on Islamic law, and he has a significant impact on the later day schools of the Malikis and the Shafi'is. And he has this discussion in his Ghiyath al-Umam where he says, look, the spoils of war as a whole were not the purpose behind which warfare is fought. So at the end of a battle, you find their tanks, you find their weaponry, you find their swords and shields, etc. You have rules to do with these things, but that is not why you fight. And yes, there's rules regarding these things and how we deal with them justly and equitably, but the rules are not the purpose behind why we fight. So the anfal ghayr maqsood, he says, are not the purpose behind the Sharia. So actually what we do with these things, it'd be perfectly reasonable to now abandon these things. And he makes an argument for this. Again, this is the Ghazali's teacher says 4th century after Hijrah. So you have an emancipatory argument there found in the essence of an orthodox Sharia jurist based upon how he sees what is the rationale and the cause behind them. So I think, from my perspective, again, to go back to what I started with, I think actually I'm more of the view that we've lost this heritage connection and articulating things from within the tradition to be able to come out in a way that actually building on those first principles. And I think it does, therefore, it's it's someone said this recently. It's more restitution of foundational principles than a reformation of foundational principles that's required in order to deal with some of the issues that we're dealing with in modernity, and the acceptance of what essentially is described as modernity, which is the de-superstitionizing of everything in our public life and determining things by merit and value.